Howdy, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Elliot Certain. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a second-year MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy, where I serve as events chair of Al Politique and founding director of ACLU Chicago, the student-led civil liberties group at the Harris School. I'm also a fellows ambassador at the Institute of Politics for Pritzker fellow Alex Wagner, and I've been attending IOP events since my first year at Harris. I'm originally from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and my policy interests center on queer rights, civil liberties, and constitutional protections, issues that make tonight's conversation especially meaningful to me. I'm honored to welcome Congresswoman Sarah McBride, who represents Delaware in the United States House of Representatives. Before her election in 2024, she served in the Delaware State Senate, where she made history as the first openly transgender state senator in the nation. Congresswoman McBride has been a lifelong advocate for equality, leading efforts to expand healthcare access, strengthen workplace protections, and ensure that every American can live with dignity. Joining her tonight is David Axelrod, the founding director of the Institute of Politics, a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama, and a senior political commentator on CNN. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your phones. After the conversation, microphones will be placed in the audience for Q&A, with students being given the priority for asking questions. Finally, if you're interested in attending more IOP events, like including Senator Lisa Murkowski in conversation with David French tomorrow night right here at the International House, or IOP Pritzker Fellow and former ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman, in conversation with David Axelrod and George Packer, please visit politics.uchicago.edu. And now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Congresswoman Sarah McBride and David Axelrod.
Thanks. Thanks, Elliot. Thank you. And welcome. It's always good to be home. Good to see all of you. Congressman, we had a conversation back in July after you did a really, really amazing podcast with Ezra Klein. And I said I wanted to bring you here. And I went back and listened to it again in preparation for this. And then I took the transcript and I underlined all the things that I thought were significant. And I realized I had underlined the whole darn thing. And I don't have the time to ask about every single thing in there. But the kicking off point is we have so many loud voices in our politics. And what we really need is some wisdom. And I thought there was so much wisdom in what you had to say. But you used words that were almost foreign to our ears, like grace, kindness, compromise, and hope. Do you feel out of step with the times here?
You know, I think right now there's no question that this country is facing a crisis of hope. And it's actually one of the reasons why I decided to run for office and run for federal office. But before I get into that, let me just say thank you for bringing me here. Elliot, thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be back here at the University of Chicago, and speaking of hope, to be here on stage with you. My first vote was in February of 2008. For Senator Barack Obama to be the Democratic nominee for president. And for me, I feel like that election, one election alone, filled my tank with so much hope that no matter what comes my way or our country's way since then, I still feel the same hopefulness that I felt in 2007 and 2008 with that campaign.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. I remember very well that campaign and that night when Obama won. And I remember all the extravagant political commentary afterwards. And I think back at that now, and I wonder whether one thing led to another, because there were political writers who were writing about the coalition of the ascendant. The coalition of the ascendant, college-educated voters, minority voters, and so on. And when you speak in those terms, the inference is that there are winners and losers. And now this new group is ascending, and it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
That was felt, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, I think that there is, as I was saying, there's this crisis of hope in this moment that I think is rooted in people's fear that their future is not positive, that their life won't be better than their parents. There's this crisis of hope, I think, rooted in this sort of broader fear that we no longer have either the individual or collective capacity to meet the scope and the scale of the challenges that we face. Everything feels so uncertain. Everything feels so unmoored. And when things feel uncertain, when you see others presumably having progress and you feel like your life isn't experiencing that kind of progress as well, it can foster a zero-sum game mentality in our politics. But I think for me, I ran because I experienced a crisis of hope as a young person. I mean, my interest in politics rooted in this crisis of hope that I had as a kid growing up, and not only trying to figure out who I am, but trying to figure out how I fit into this world, and just fearing that the heart of this country wasn't big enough to love someone like me. And I found, in that crisis of hope, I found a little glimmer of hope in politics, because I saw it was the place where every avenue of society converges and you can make the most amount of change for the most number of people. And the last 25 years of my life have been this journey back to hope for me. And I think at the end of the day, in this crisis of hope for our country, we need people who have been on that journey to say, I've been in the darkness. I know what hopelessness feels like. But I also know that with hard work, with discipline, with a willingness to engage in difficult and painful conversations, persuasion and progress are actually possible. And I think in this moment, the answer to a crisis of hope is not to give up on hope. And while grace and patience has certainly been abused, while certainly the patience and grace extended from people of color and other marginalized folks in our society has been abused in our past, the answer to that, the course correction to that, cannot be to eliminate hope and grace from our politics, because when that happens, we take away the two most powerful ingredients for actually making change and winning conversations and winning hearts and minds.
You know, one of the things that has changed since 2008 is really the explosion of social media, which was in its infancy when we were running. We thought we were on the cutting edge because we had these things called meetups. Yeah. And it was sort of the Model T, era of social media. But today, it is a really, really powerful force, not just in our politics, but in our society. And the business model of it is really fighting against everything you're talking about.
Yeah.
The profit lies with keeping people online, and they've discovered that the way you keep people online is to play to their alienation, their anger, resentment, conspiracy theories. That really has infected our politics in a way that politics is now sort of emulating social media.
I think that social media, I remember being excited about the power of it to democratize the microphone and to lift up voices that historically had been excluded. But the profit incentives in social media and the monetization of attention and the recognition that the easiest way to gain people's attention is to, one, reinforce everything they think, and then to make them outraged, right? To give them people who either completely conform to what they think or people who are so far on the other side that they are absolutely outraged and they will hate watch whatever is put in front of them from that other side. And that has had a corrosive effect on not only our politics, but our own mental health, our own psyche. It is, I mean, I know how I feel after I spend an hour on TikTok or an hour on X. I find myself dispirited, I find myself angry, I find myself feeling, I mean, nothing.
Maybe you should stop doing that.
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is it's sort of an occupational hazard now that you have to understand it. But the problem is that the business model incentivizes an algorithm that brings out the worst in us as individuals and us as a society. And I will say, I think one of the things that I am most grateful for as an elected official is that I am forced off of social media and into the real world. And you realize a number of things. One, you realize that we aren't as divided as the algorithms make it seem, that when you're online, you see the most extreme content from maybe 5 to 10% of the public, right? There's 10% of the public or so, I'm just making up numbers, but 10% that are, we're in a post-fact world, thanks to social media. You've got a small minority that are doom posters, and everyone else is basically a doom scroller. And for the vast majority of us who are doom scrollers, because of the algorithm, essentially 100% of the content we're seeing is from the engaged minority, the doom posters. And it gives us a false perception of what reality is. It's availability bias. 100% of the content is 5 or 10% of the public. And it can lead you to believe that persuasion is pointless. Because when you see those extreme examples on either side on social media, you go, well, there's no point in having a conversation. There's no point in engaging in the art of politics because we are so divided that it's worthless. And for me, the best thing about being an elected official is I'm forced out of that echo chamber and that social media environment, and I'm actually able to engage with the vast majority who are the doom scrollers or just not even on social media at all. And you realize that while social media can impact reality, it is not representative of it. Yeah. And that most people fall somewhere in the middle of those extremes, and you can actually have a conversation with those folks, and you can open their hearts and change their minds. And it reminds me that politics can still be the successful art of persuasion.
Well, the good news here is that the House of Representatives apparently is never going to meet again, so you'll have a lot of time to spend with the normal people.
That's right. That's true.
So that's good. You, I want to go back to your own journey here because you talked about your own battle with hopelessness and trying to find your way. First of all, you've been involved in politics since you were quite young. You were really attracted to it. And you worked in a bunch of campaigns as a kid. And then you went to American University. You were president of the student body there. And as you finished your tenure there, you came out and you did it in an essay in the school newspaper. And in that essay, you basically said you were struggling with what the tension between your ambition to be a politician and living your life in the identity that was yours. But now you're a congressman. You're a member of Congress. what does that tell you?
So I will start by just saying that when I wrote that note, you can tell that I had completely given up on any capacity to be in politics because I broke the cardinal rule of politics, which is to pretend like you don't ever want to go into politics. We love for politicians to pretend like they wake up one morning and then just find themselves running for office and then find themselves in public office. And that's an incredibly authentic experience for some people who run for office. It's not the experience for everyone, and truthfully, it wasn't the experience for me. I did want to go into politics. I never thought I'd be able to run for office as my authentic self. And when I decided to come out to my family and then eventually to my community and write that op-ed in the newspaper, student newspaper, that was the conclusion of sort of a process of grief where I was grieving any future for myself. And the final stage of grief is acceptance. And I had to accept the loss of any future in order to accept myself. And that was a true, authentic acceptance of a loss of any future, because in that coming out note, I talked about how I had wanted to be in politics, and I had thought that it was impossible if I came out. And then it was the first experiences of acceptance from my family and friends and eventually campus community that I started to see that maybe it wasn't impossible. And then, like I said, over the 10 years or so, 15 years since coming out, having the opportunity to work in Delaware to pass non-discrimination protections and marriage equality, having the opportunity to help draft the comprehensive non-discrimination law, civil rights law, that's at the center of the national LGBTQ movement, having the opportunity to get to the state Senate and pass paid leave and then eventually get elected to Congress, I have had a front row seat to change that once seemed so impossible to me that it was almost incomprehensible, not only become possible, but become a reality. And that is a testament to people in my life. It's a testament to my state. It's also a testament to the power of grace and the power of conversation, because none of that would have been possible if every single time I faced an indignity or an invasive question that felt remotely dehumanizing, or every single time I found myself in a space with people who not only didn't understand me, but who were actively hostile to me, if I had shut down the conversation and been unwilling to extend any grace to people. I always say, grace is the space where change occurs. And you can't expect people to change. One, if you don't give them the chance to change by giving them the chance to hear from you and be educated by you, but you also can't expect people to change if you don't create the incentive structures for people to change. First, that space for them to grow, and then the reward at the end of that growth for no longer being guilty for being wrong, the reward of being told, thank you for changing, right? If you feel like you are permanently guilty for having been wrong and you are provided no space and grace to grow, then not only will you not change, you now have an added incentive to make sure that your wrong position maintains its power as the predominant political position, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
And so only when we extend that grace, only when we can have those conversations, one, do we create the incentive for people to change. And for me, that was so necessary for all of that progress that I'm now the beneficiary of. And I am, for as crappy as it is to be in Congress in this moment in time.
Yeah, that's your punishment.
Yeah. I was saying to you, the last couple of weeks, I've been reminded of what it's like not to work in a hostile work environment because my Republican colleagues aren't there anymore. But I am truly in awe every single day, because every single day I wake up and I get to live a life of purpose and meaning and authenticity all at the same time, and I don't take that for granted at all.
But you talk about the indignities that one has to confront, and you confronted them when you came to Congress. And interestingly, you got elected in a year when trans issues were front and center because the president spent a lot of money putting it there, and you won, and you went, and the momentum from all of that spilled into your interactions with your colleagues, and one of the first things they did was pass a bill to forbid you from using the women's bathroom. I raise it because you did not put up a kind of loud protest to that. Explain why, and talk about how people in your own community and on the left responded to that.
So I had always said, in preparation for my election, to a lot of folks in my own community, the challenge for me is that there are going to be people who will see my service as an opportunity to gain attention, and they will come for me. And my job is going to be to not give them the response that they want. And I think abstractly people understood. But in that moment after the election, right after $200 million had been spent on anti-trans ads, at a moment where people were, I think, rightfully very scared about what was to come, I think what is often the case when you are a first is that people in your own community viscerally feel your highs, but they also viscerally feel your lows.
Yeah, I worked for a guy who experienced that.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of times when someone sees that visceral low or sees that low and experiences it themselves, they desperately want to see you fight back in a way that almost releases their emotion, right? Unburdens them of that emotion because they're watching you fight back on their behalf in that moment. And I get that instinct. I think it's a very human instinct. But the challenge of being a first is that you can't give them that response. And I am in no way comparing my experience to this by any stretch of the imagination. Different issues, different dynamics, different prejudices. But when I was experiencing the bathroom thing, someone texted me, "You need to watch the movie 42."
About Jackie Robinson?
Yeah. And there is a scene in that movie where Jackie is brought into the office of the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the owner says, he starts to insult him and try to provoke him into anger. And when he gets angry, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers says, "You can't get angry." And he says, "You don't want me to be strong enough to fight back?" He says, "I want you to be strong enough not to fight back, because when you are a first, if you respond to a slur with a slur, they will only hear yours. When you respond to a punch with a punch, they'll say you're the aggressor." That is the challenge of being a first in a space, of having the discipline and the strength not to fight back at every indignity. And I will just say this, because there's a lot of parts of this that I want to explore here, because I think it's really important. And I think it's important because a lot of people felt what I experienced. And that is one, what my community in Delaware needs is for me to be an effective member of Congress. They were trying to diminish my effectiveness, one. Two, what I think the trans community needs is they need the public to see that transness is a human experience and that trans people are full people, rather than transness as some political action. And when I am seen as a full person, when I am seen as an effective legislator working on all of the issues that matter for all of my constituents, that is humanizing for trans people and inoculates the public to the caricature of trans people that the right is fostering, the caricature that is allowing them to go after trans people. And I think that when you think back to some of the most powerful visuals of the civil rights movement, you think about students integrating a school in the 1950s, and the image of a student walking forward from a place of dignity and grace in that moment with slurs being hurled at them. They weren't normalizing those slurs by not responding. They were providing the public with a very clear visual contrast between the inhumanity of the haters and their literal humanity. Because the public is busy, they're going about their lives, and they might, particularly in today's day and age, only see this visual while scrolling on their social media, and they get a glimpse, a millisecond of a glimpse. They need that very clear visual about what side of history they should be on, of who's right and who's wrong, who's the bully and who's the bullied. And if those students were screaming back, the public would have just seen people yelling at each other. And so the public needed that contrast in this moment too. But then the final thing I will say is part of politics is understanding what makes people tick, right? What motivates the public, also what motivates your colleagues. And the reality is that all of that behavior was attention seeking. It was a pitiful attempt to use my service to get attention for themselves. I don't need to clout chase off of my colleagues to get attention. I can get attention based on my own merits. But some of my colleagues know that the easy way, the quick fix, the quick hit, is to be outrageous. And
you talked about it as a reality show.
As a reality show. And you know, what is the fastest way to get airtime on a reality show? It's to throw wine in someone's face. But what I used to think, when I got there, what I initially thought was they were doing this from an intellectual process, where they go, I'm in a body of 435 people, attention in this competitive attention economy is power. It increases my profile, it increases my leverage, it increases my ability to move forward in politics. But what I actually didn't understand is that what is at play here is actually much more basic than that. It's not an intellectual pursuit of attention for power's sake. It is addictive behavior. I often hear about colleagues, they were so normal when they got here. And then something happens, they intentionally or unintentionally go viral. And something changes instantly. We talked about the influence of social media. Social media is addictive, we know that. And when you post a picture on social media and get a lot of likes, it's like a cigarette, right? It's a little addictive. But if you go viral, that is a high that is instantly addictive. And people will start to engage in self-destructive behavior in pursuit of that next high. And they don't care who they take down in the process of getting that next high of virality. And part of my job is to not be an effective vessel for that high. And when I can tell you, when I fight back versus when I just turn the other cheek, the amount of attention they get varies dramatically. And it's one of the reasons why over the last 10 months, the amount of hatred I get from my colleagues, the amount of attention-seeking behavior that I am on the receiving end of, it has dissipated dramatically because they have realized I will not be used effectively to clout chase off of, and I will not be an effective vessel for their pursuit of that attention high.
Yeah. You know what else is addictive? Boatloads of money, which also flows when you, oftentimes in politics, when you get that high, it also is a fundraising device.
I've been surprised, though, that every time my colleagues, the people who have come for me, I don't fundraise off of it when it happens. But you look at their reports and my reports, and in the 2 weeks after the attacks on me, they don't raise that much money. They raise a fraction of what organically comes into my accounts. And so
that may be one way to stop them when you tell them that.
Right? But that's when I started to realize this isn't intellectual. This isn't in pursuit for a lot of these folks of power or money. It's actually a physiological addiction they have to attention that they stumbled upon, but then the high was so great that they will stop at nothing to find it again.
I want to talk about another thing that you spoke about at length in that interview and elsewhere, and that is we live in this age of illiberalism and intolerance, and but you've said that it's obvious we see it from the right, but we've also seen it from the left, and I was so interested in that because you're out there with your constituents, and I'm sure you're probing sort of what do you see in the Democratic Party? What do you see? And I'm sure some of these themes bubble up. Talk a little bit about that.
So, first of all, I think in the 2010s and early 2020s, I think our own coalition developed a false sense of, to your point earlier, ascendancy, sort of cultural victory, cultural momentum.
Triumphalism.
Yes, that resulted in us thinking that we didn't have to have conversations anymore. That by recognizing that the conversations were hurtful and unfair, we had won, and therefore we could stop the conversation. And I think that misunderstands both the permanency of progress, but also the backlash that can occur when people feel like they can't ask questions or have conversations, and a resentment that people feel. I also think that, and I say this as someone who went to a very progressive college, I was just having this conversation with a colleague. I think that when you have a coalition for whom their formative political years occur on a college campus that is overwhelmingly progressive, you almost you get into this mindset of, well, obviously I'm right. There's no debate. And the conservatives on those campuses, actually, they're the ones forced to defend their ideas. We never have to defend our ideas. And it's actually one of the reasons why I think younger conservatives are so good at persuasion right now, is because they're used to having to defend their ideas, and we have gotten complacent on college campuses because we haven't felt the need to defend our positions, and we have felt like having to defend our positions is oppressive in and of itself. And again, it may be unfair, but none of that progress is permanent. And as we continue to want to make progress, you are going to continue to have conversations in order to make that progress possible. And I think that there has been a backlash to an illiberalism that exists on the left. Now, I think we're going to see a backlash that's occurring with the same phenomenon on the right. You're starting to hear people call them the woke right, because there is a new sort of cancel culture that is existing on the right that I think for a while did exist on the left.
Let me just interrupt you for a second. You just said, it's interesting. The word woke itself has a certain implication.
Yeah. I think I think it started as a description of sort of progressive values, but what I think it became a catch-all for was an absolutism that is only possible legally or culturally in authoritarianism. And one of the things you hear, I was listening to someone the other day who was mentioning this, but right now we're seeing illiberalism from the right with the force of government. But unless you are on the receiving end of that illiberalism, it can feel abstract, right? Unless you're trans yourself, or unless you are an immigrant yourself, that legal illiberalism can feel abstract. What we had was sort of a cultural illiberalism, and I think that actually feels for a larger segment of the population more present, because they're afraid to ask questions, they're afraid to engage in conversation. And I think that builds a frustration and a resentment that then is exploited by the right to justify, quote, anti-woke actions. And I think that that's a dynamic that we've seen over the last couple of years. I think that this is a moment where we have to decide. We talk a lot about this battle between authoritarianism and democracy. We have to decide in this moment whether we genuinely believe in democracy. Not as a talking point, not as an abstraction, not only when it's going well for us, whether we genuinely believe in it. Because the reality is, in a liberal democracy, difficult, painful, uncomfortable conversations are not a bug of democracy, those are a feature of democracy. It's how you maintain your capacity to change hearts and minds and move the public, and therefore move policy and politics. That is a necessary foundation, and it's not always fair, and it's not always easy. But how can we expect that the process for progress or the process of overcoming marginalization is going to be easy or fair? No, that's where the burdens and the barriers are going to be greatest. And while no one's rights should depend on the whims of public sentiment, the truth is nothing is genuinely sustainable without public opinion, and nothing is actually impossible with it.
I think Lincoln said something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, I get wanting to be comfortable. But in this moment, if everything is truly on the line, and the way to save it is to be uncomfortable or to be more uncomfortable, well, damn it, I think we owe it to ourselves and one another to be willing to be uncomfortable, to move past the comfort of preaching to our own choir and actually exercise the courage of growing our congregation.
I want to ask about a couple of other things before we turn it over to the audience. And it's related to what you just said. I was really interested in hearing you talk about how one deals with some of the issues that have arisen around the trans community, around the role of parents and how you deal with children, and also the issue of school sports and so on. And the way you cut those issues was really interesting to me, because, we'll let them be the judge.
Well, so I think that the public makes a distinction between a sort of libertarian live and let live philosophy, especially when it comes to adults, and their perception of sort of active government endorsement of something through funding, or in this particular case, anything revolving around young people. And I think that we have to just understand that to figure out what is the right way to respond. And I think as we are navigating these issues, the public is in a place where the public, I believe, is willing to say, I don't understand what it means to be trans. I don't understand what it means, what it's like, and why a person decides to come out and transition. And it seems like a big decision for a young person to make. And I'm not in those families' shoes. And I can understand that in this difficult circumstance, the people who are best able to make these decisions are patients, parents, and their providers, not the government. Similarly, on sports, I think the public, many people in the public have understandable questions, and in some cases see a tension between the principles of fairness and respect in school sports. To the degree that there is a tension, and recognizing that inevitably you will have to have rules constructed to figure out how to balance those principles and how to navigate individual circumstances, the place where those decisions should be made are not with 435 people who know very little about school sports and even less about trans people, but rather with individual athletic associations who best understand their sport and the science and the data. Right now, we're seeing right-wing politicians exploit trans young people and these particular issues to remove the humanity of this larger conversation, to divert from the fact that we are fundamentally talking about basic freedom in our society to live full, healthy, authentic lives, the best way that we as individuals can do so. And I think that if we can get to a place where we recognize that families can make decisions, that families with doctors can make decisions, that individual athletic associations can make decisions, I think we will find compassionate policies that balance all of those principles in a way that meets the public where they are and allows us to get back to a place where we can start having a conversation again about the fundamental humanity of trans people and the need for everyone to have a job and basic health care and housing and all of the other necessities that trans people and all people have and need. And let me just say this last thing, because I think that when we are talking about these issues, especially around trans young people, one thing that I think the public does need to understand, and I think people like me have to do a better job of explaining, is that I was a young person at one point too. I knew who I was. And I know how different my life would have been had time and science moved at a pace that was a little bit faster and would have allowed me to live authentically a little bit earlier. And that doesn't mean there aren't complicated questions. That doesn't mean that we should guarantee that people who don't need care don't get it, or that sports are balancing all of these different equities. But it does mean that at the end of the day, we're talking about people. And that all these trans adults that you believe have a right to live authentically and fully in our society, that they too were once young people who knew who they were and would have loved to have a childhood where they could live authentically too.
You wrote that your mother was devastated when you came out, and you told her if parents should play a larger role in these decisions, or if their role in these decisions should be recognized, what would your mother have said if you had come to her at a younger age and said, I want to transition?
I think she similarly would have been devastated. But I think my parents would have done what they did when I came out to them at 21, which is they would have gone online, they would have done some research, they would have connected with a provider who had some expertise in this area, and we as a family would have gone in together to have that conversation with a provider to figure out what was the best course of healthcare treatment for me, which is what every person is deserving of, regardless of their age.
I just want to ask this one thing, and then there's the microphone there, which is for your use and to suggest to me that it's time for you guys to stand up behind that microphone and get to ask your questions. But one of the things that I've quoted you on quite a bit is your analysis of what the Democratic Party itself needs to do, and your observation that when you go out and speak to your constituents in Delaware, that their focus is very much on kitchen table issues and affordability and so on. But their perception is that the Democratic Party's focus is not.
Yeah.
And your advice is the main thing should be the main thing. Talk a little bit more about that.
So at the end of the day, I think our tactics in politics have changed pretty dramatically over the last 30 years with new technologies, but the strategies and the fundamentals of politics actually remain largely unchanged. And that is that at the end of the day, the economy is the most important issue. And the challenge in the last election for Democrats with the anti-trans ads, it wasn't actually even the sort of substance of the ad. It wasn't specific to trans people because, one, it was trans people, immigration, and incarcerated folks too, right? It was, but that ad, that they them ad, it was like, it was transition-related, government-funded transition-related care for undocumented trans people in immigration detention facilities, right? It was like all of that together.
And it was intended to suggest that this is what the Democratic Party is interested in.
And that was what I was going to say, is that the Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for us, was about feeding into a narrative that the Democratic Party was not concerned with broad universal problems, broad economic problems, that we were consumed with, quote, niche issues. And whether that is a fair or accurate perception, it is the reality of the perception. And even though Democrats, I will say, it was the Republicans who are obsessed with cultural war issues. They're the ones spending money on it. They were the ones talking about it constantly. I do think we actually erred in not talking about it clearly as Democrats in the last election. We ceded the narrative to the Republicans. But I will say, whether you talk about it or not, people will perceive that a particular issue area is your priority, even if you're not talking about it, if they see it as a threshold issue for your party. And so when we communicate to folks, even if you're with us on 80% of trans issues, but you're not welcomed in our coalition and we deem you a bigot because you have concerns around trans participation in sports, what the voter hears is that is a priority issue for you, even if you're not talking about it. Because if you're willing to cast me aside because of my position on that one particular policy within a ecosystem of larger, not only trans issues, but other issues, then I am hearing that that is your threshold issue and therefore your priority issue. And so, one, we have fed that narrative by engaging in a way that suggests to people who have concerns or fall in a different place, 70% of the public on this issue, that they're not welcomed in our coalition. That is not productive in creating a majoritarian coalition to defeat authoritarianism in this moment, but it's also unproductive in actually changing people's minds on those issues, because you can't have a conversation if you're casting them out of your coalition. And I think one of the problems in our politics right now is that for the last decade, we have started to treat our relationships as a tool to reward or punish people based on their beliefs. We say, you have the wrong belief, my punishment is I'm cutting you off from my life. And what it has done, it has conditioned us into thinking that being in relationship with people means we condone everything they believe. Because if we didn't, we would cut them off. That is a surefire way to stop a conversation that would result in evolution and actually educating that person, but it is also terrible coalition politics. You cannot build a coalition with that mindset. We have to change our mindset that welcoming people in doesn't mean we are agreeing with everything that they say. It does not mean we are condoning everything that they say. In fact, it is our opportunity to start a conversation to maybe convince them of the rightness of our cause on a whole host of issues that they're not yet there with us on yet. I will say beyond that for the party, sorry, this is a long answer, but it's a big question.
Big one to drop on you right when the people were lining up, but.
But I think to all of these questions and to all of that sort of impression that we leave people with, voters ask two questions when they go to the polls. The first question is very personal and very visceral, and it's, does this candidate like me? If I'm calling you a bigot, if I'm telling you that you're stupid, I'm communicating to you that I don't like you. And by extension, I don't respect you and I don't care for you. The second question is, what does this candidate think? What are their policies? If you can't answer that first question to a voter's satisfaction, you have no chance in convincing them on the second one. And whether people can sit here and debate, well, this person is a bigot for this or that, what does that get us? Where does that get us? And I think the path forward in this moment is for our party is essentially three key things. One, and I will say, I think the person who is doing this the best right now is someone who's controversial in politics right now, but it's Zoran Mamdani. He's doing three things very successfully. The first is the politics of affordability. He is hyper-focused on the politics of affordability. Second is, I call it the politics of Ted Lasso. He is curious, not judgmental. He goes to people and talks to them, not only across every background, but across ideology. The first viral video he did was a video of him doing man-on-the-street interviews with Trump supporters, where people saw this very progressive Democrat having a civil, respectful dialogue with a Trump supporter and finding common ground with them. And then the third is sort of the politics of Mr. Rogers, which is sort of rooting your politics in a sense of a neighborly duty to care that is rooted in a sense of place. And he has done a very New York first politics. And Trump does it with America first, but it's a sense of place. And I think if we can master a politics of affordability, a politics that is curious and not judgmental, and a politics that is rooted in our sense of place, our sense of community, and therefore our sense of belonging with one another, I think that is a successful recipe, whether you are progressive or center-left or moderate. I think that is a successful recipe for success at the ballot box.
I got to write that down. Okay, I should have said this at the beginning, but keep your questions brief and make sure that they actually are questions. Okay, go ahead.
I'll try to keep my answers brief.
I'm Christopher Gould. I'm a first year studying economics, and you just said that you don't think the government should be involved in cases of trans children. So my question is regarding that. In Indiana, a judge removed the transgender teen from their parents' custody after the parents refused to allow their minor to undergo gender identity treatment. Do you support the state forcibly taking children who are said to subscribe to trans ideology from their parents and applying social and medical conditioning upon them against their parents' wishes?
What's trans ideology?
The idea that you can change your gender or sex through medical ways.
Okay. A reality of human existence that has existed across time and across cultures. So just human diversity is what we're talking about here. But what I would say is, I'm not a judge in that case. I'm not familiar with the specifics of that case, so I can't comment on the specifics of a particular judicial decision. There are cases before judges all the time that evaluate the safety of a child within the parent's care. And judges find often that unfortunately and tragically a child is not safe in the care of their parents. That's a horrific and tragic outcome that should only happen in the most extreme circumstances. I can't speak to that particular place. What I can say is that I believe that parents and children and doctors should be able to make these decisions together, right? And that families should absolutely be involved in those decisions. But I can't speak to that particular case.
Well, do you think that a parent should have?
Wait.
Sorry, thank you.
Next question, please.
My name's Akshay Kirthi. I'm a third year in the college majoring in biology. I saw a video of you in an elementary school classroom teaching to what looks like kindergartners, where you were reading a book called Jazz and Friends, and you gave the commentary that, quote, she went with her family to the doctor, and the doctor said that she's a girl, and everyone should see her and treat her like a girl, and, quote, like Jazz said, that makes her a little different from some of the other kids, and Jazz at the end talks about how being different is good. Do you think that it's appropriate to tell impressionable children who think that the tooth fairy is real that it's good to go to the doctor and transition socially and eventually with hormones and surgery when these children barely understand what gender is?
So that's not what I said. I said that.
I have a quote.
Yeah,
from a video.
and I'm going to tell you what that quote was. That quote was, being different is good. That it's good that we have differences in society, that society would be very boring if everyone was exactly the same. Not that being trans is good or bad, but that diversity in our society is good, and we should value diversity. That's what that was saying, one. Two, I was at a job, it was 7 years ago. All of those young people there were there with parental permission, because at the end of the day, I don't believe that anyone is too young to learn to be kind. And that's what that was about. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's keep going here.
I think we have a question in the balcony.
Oh, hey.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I'm so glad everyone is turning to look at me. I just wanted to ask, I understand what you're saying about, not, dying on the hill of, trans issues being our, exclusive metric in the Democratic Party. I think everything you're saying is maybe a lesson in tolerance I could learn. But when it comes to the concept of kitchen table issues for trans Americans,
Yes.
or for parents of trans Americans, or friends, or lovers, or just community members of trans Americans, their rights and respect and consideration are kitchen table issues. And
Yes.
I understand your personal position, with the bathroom stuff in Congress.
Can you just,
Sorry, yeah, make it a question.
Get to the question,
I got it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, totally fair. So, where do you draw that balance of wanting to prioritize kitchen table issues for the average American while also giving trans people and people who love trans people the sign that you do value them and are thinking of them as a party, not just you specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I appreciate that question, and I think it's a helpful question to sort of pull the thread a little bit more on that, which is, one, I don't think politicians need to change what their policy position is. I don't think that anyone needs to throw anyone under the bus or should throw anyone under the bus. I think that we have to meet people where they are, because I think those trans constituents need us to do the hard work of changing hearts and minds, which is only possible if we're not excommunicating people because they're not with us on 100% of trans issues. I'm proud that my Democratic colleagues have been almost unanimously committed to defending my trans constituents and trans people in this moment. I think some of them needed a bit more comfort in figuring out how to navigate those issues and how to talk about those issues, because I think one of the reasons why we saw Democrats in the last election not really talk about these issues is because they were scared. They didn't know how to talk about these issues in a way that sort of met voters where they were while also not disrespecting trans people. And I think I'm trying to provide them an opportunity and a path forward to be able to strike that right balance in a way that is principled and pragmatic at the same time. The reality of politics is we can't talk about every issue all the time, right? Like, you have to prioritize. Governing is prioritizing, politics is prioritizing. And obviously, we can defend and must defend vulnerable communities in this country in this moment, and we should defend them and talk about how we're defending them and why we're defending them. And we can't let that be all that we talk about, because there's so much happening right now that it could be all that we're talking about. And the reality is that I believe for trans people in this country, the most important thing that can happen to stop the attacks on trans people is for us to no longer have anti-trans politicians in control of every part of the federal government. And sometimes we have to learn, as much as we want it, as comforting as it feels, that we shouldn't always fight fights in ways that feel viscerally comforting to us, or fight fights that feel viscerally comforting to us, but aren't actually constructive in winning the power we need to stop the attacks or to make the progress that we need to make. And so I hear it, and like, I think that there is absolutely a way for us to honor all of our constituents and show a fight and show a defense for all of our constituents. But it's not always going to look like the performative fight that gives comfort, because at the end of the day, I get why people want comfort, but comfort doesn't keep them in their home. Comfort doesn't keep them in their job. Comfort doesn't protect them from bullies. What does is progress, and in this particular case, what does is winning the next election, and that only happens if we are speaking to the vast majority of the public about what is keeping them up at night.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student. My question for you is, I'm a trans man. I came out a decade ago when I was 15, and I'm at a point now where I'm kind of undercover. People don't really notice. And I often do so because when people learn I'm trans, it often becomes the only thing I am to them. So my question for you is, how do you balance the experiences you've had living as a trans woman when you're trying to pursue other policy points in a way that, you know, your colleagues aren't just going to be like, oh yeah, you're trans, when you're trying to talk environment, for instance?
That's a great question. One, I will just say in a sort of simple way, honestly, I think humor helps a lot. It's very disarming, and some of my favorite Republican relationships that I have built over the last 10 months have been just rooted in basic humor, and I think it diffuses situations, it puts them at ease, and then it actually allows them to see me as a fuller person. But I also think part of it is being the legislator that I know I can be, that I want to be, and that I believe I am. I mean, I'm a very good legislator. And I have seen time and time again that maybe not in the first conversation, maybe not in the second conversation, maybe it takes time, but through both the power of proximity and the power of having conversations on other issues, that I start to see this sort of trans-colored glasses that they see me through begin to dissipate. And it's why I think one of the things that I have to offer the trans community in this moment is being a legislator who is effective and working on issues. Yes, you know, look, we've talked a lot about trans issues tonight. Obviously, I'm happy to talk about these issues, but also for people to see a legislator who is trans, who's talking about healthcare and paid family and medical leave and affordable childcare and affordable housing. That goes a long way in humanizing trans people writ large. It also goes a long way in humanizing me to my colleagues. One of my favorite stories in my 4 years in the Delaware General Assembly was an experience I had in June of 2023. And I had been very conscious about being supportive of LGBTQ specific legislation in the General Assembly, but I had actually shied away from sponsoring, as the prime sponsor, LGBTQ bills, just because I knew that it would pigeonhole me and silo me and reinforce this perception that I was the trans state senator working on trans issues. And I had ultimately decided to be the prime sponsor on a bill that bans what's called the LGBTQ panic defense in Delaware. And that's a defense, for those of you who aren't familiar, that essentially says that a perpetrator of violence can't be held as accountable for their violence against an LGBTQ person because they were just so disgusted when they realized that the person in front of them was LGBTQ that they were driven to violence. And a number of states have banned that defense in state courts. Delaware was considering similar legislation. It had passed the state house on essentially partisan lines. And it came before us in the state Senate, and I was the prime sponsor. Coincidentally, entirely coincidentally, it was the same week that I had announced my campaign for Congress. And probably unsurprising to people in this room, when I announced for Congress, there was a lot of feedback. A lot of it was very positive, fortunately, but some of it was very negative to the point where we had to have security on the floor of the state Senate, something that we don't usually have in Delaware. And my Republican colleagues understood why that security was there. And so I stand up and I introduce the bill and I talk about what it means for the community and why this policy is important. I talk about what it means for me. I talk about the fear that LGBTQ people live with, the risk of violence. And I pause and I sort of brace myself for a debate about violence against LGBTQ people. I brace myself for my Republican colleagues to stand up, say, at best, this is a solution in search of a problem. At worst, that this violence is understandable, if not justifiable. But that's not what happened. In that moment, every single Republican in that chamber stood up. They not only affirmed the dignity of LGBTQ lives, they not only made it clear and validated the very real fear that LGBTQ people live with every single day. They not only all declared that they would be voting for the bill, but led by the most conservative member of that caucus, perhaps for the first time in any legislative body in this country's history, every single Republican stood up and asked to be added as co-sponsors to the legislation. And look, saying that there's no excuse for violence against a community is maybe the bare minimum. But what happened in that moment was so much more profound than the policy itself. Because after 3 years of working with these colleagues, 3 years of these colleagues both debating me and in some cases having conversations of fierce agreement with me on a whole host of issues, after passing dozens of bills, big bills and small bills, all of which except for one passed with bipartisan support, my colleagues had started to see me as a full human being. And in that moment, you could see the recognition of the fact that the political is fundamentally personal, that the people that we were talking about, the policy that we were talking about impacts real people who they know and yes, they care about. And you can't undo that synaptic connection once it exists. You can't undo that connection between humanity and policy once it occurs. And it's in those small, almost invisible moments of recognition that so much of our progress is built on. And I am just so grateful that I have had the privilege of being able to see that in my life. Thank you.
So much.
Upstairs.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My name is Aaron. I'm a first year in the college, majoring in political science. My question for you, you're the highest ranking trans politician in the country, and you've been thrust into the limelight as this national voice for trans people all across the country. So with that in mind, my question for you is, how do you choose which battles related to your identity to pick? And how do you manage to keep a level head in the face of all of this adversity?
That's a good question. So one of the things that I have always said is that if I am the issue, like if it's about me, I'm just gonna let it slide off my shoulder. I'm not there to talk about myself. I'm not there to have fights with my colleagues about how I am treated. I am there to work for, defend, and fight for my constituents. And so when there's a policy that attacks my constituents who are trans, I, of course, will speak out. I will push back. Now, there are also different ways, right? There's voting. There's voting and making a statement. There's conversations that you have behind the scenes, and I guarantee you, as a co-chair of the LGBT Equality Caucus on the Hill, a lot of my work is behind the scenes. It's in quiet conversations with colleagues who have questions and who are curious and who know that I'm a safe place for them to ask questions that they might be scared to ask other places. And of course, sometimes it's proactively leading. So the first speech that I gave on the floor of the House of Representatives on trans rights was about the transgender troop ban. And when the National Defense Authorization Act came up, I introduced 2 amendments to that bill. 1, removing the ban on trans service members, and 2, protecting the retirement benefits of trans service members who were being discharged under the ban, who were seeing their retirement benefits that they had earned and qualified for revoked from them. And those were the first 2 pieces of legislation that I introduced specifically on trans issues. I had introduced other bills on other topics. And I recognize that people will often look to me as a sign of what the message is or where they should lean in. And I think it's important for us to lean in, especially on that issue. We know that the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell laid the foundation for marriage equality. We know that when you're banning people from a job simply because of their identity, that is a textbook example of discrimination. And we know that service members, whether they be gay in the context of DADT or trans in the context of this ban, that service members reinforce for the public that LGBTQ people are part of the fabric of this nation, that they are patriots, that they are qualified, they're damn good service members when they serve, and that they love this country too. And there is no more universal message than that. And so I chose to lean in there for all of those reasons.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for those who didn't get to ask their questions. Let us finish where we started, and at a time in which we are at such loggerheads, seemingly, what does specifically give you hope? What do you want? What do you want people who are worried about the future to grab onto?
So the students and I that met before this gathering, we had this precise conversation. Because I really feel for particularly the undergrad or young graduate students who are here who essentially only really remember a politics defined by Donald Trump, which is an experience that you have in the shadow of a period in our politics when hope felt organic. And that duality, I think, leads us to think either you have hope as an organic emotion or you don't have hope at all. And I think about what it must have been like for predecessors of mine who served prior to the 1960s. And what I realize when I think about those moments in our country's history is that the sense of sort of inevitability, the organic sense of emotion, or the organic sense of hope that we felt during the Obama years or in the lead up, that with hard work, that if we vote and volunteer, that change becomes inevitable, that sense of inevitability with hard work is the exception in our country's history. What's scary about this moment is we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're not sure whether if we vote and volunteer that things will work out, and that feels different than before, than the preceding moment in our politics. And what I take comfort in, what I find hope in, is that sense of inevitability is the exception. When I go onto the floor of the House of Representatives, I enter a chamber that Congress moved to just before the Civil War. That means that's the place where the 13th Amendment was passed, where the 14th Amendment was passed, where women got the right to vote, where Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid were created. We sit in the chairs where the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. And when you step out of the present, which views history with the hindsight of inevitability, and you step into the shoes of not only my predecessors, but the advocates and activists who fought for that change that we benefit from that now seems inevitable to us, you realize that they couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. You cannot tell me that the reasons for hopelessness now are greater than the reasons for hopelessness for an enslaved person in the 1850s who had no reason to believe that an Emancipation Proclamation was on the horizon. You cannot tell me that the reasons for hopelessness now are greater than the reasons for hopelessness for an unemployed worker during the early days of the Great Depression who had never heard of a New Deal. You cannot tell me that the reasons for hopelessness now are greater than the reasons for hopelessness for a closeted LGBTQ person in the 1950s who never knew of a country where they could live openly and authentically as themselves without violating the law. They had every reason to give up hope. They had every reason to lose faith. They had every reason to fall to despair and cynicism, to believe that politics couldn't work for them or deliver for them because it never had. But they didn't. With strategy and with discipline, with grace, with a willingness to do the unfair work, the hard work of change making, they summoned their hope, they found the light, and they changed the world. And I have to believe that in this moment, with all of the tools that we have at our disposal, with the knowledge of a politics that makes change that seems impossible possible, then so too can we and must we. So thank you all very much for having me.
Thank you.